Welcome everyone to our session, How can WTO agriculture negotiations contribute to global food security? As WTO members are negotiating new rules for trade in food and agriculture, very close to where we are now, by the way, IISD is organizing this informal dialogue, this roundtable, to discuss how trade rules can promote food security in its 4 dimensions. I am absolutely thrilled to moderate this high-level roundtable today. We have the FAO, represented by Cosimo Besani, an agriculture trade policy analyst who has written extensively about trade policies, and he's a regular speaker on these issues as well. I would like to say it's an absolute honor for me and for IISD to be accompanied today by 2 ambassadors to the WTO. Her Excellency Sofia Bosa, permanent representative of Chile to the WTO, and His Excellency Etienne Oudot de Dempille, permanent representative of France to the WTO. Both ambassadors know the agriculture dossier quite well, and in fact they have been working on trade in agriculture before being posted to Geneva. Ambassador Bosa is an agricultural economist with an extensive record of publications on agri-food governance, food markets, and international trade. Ambassador Oudot de Dempille is a senior trade negotiator with more than 25 years of experience in trade policy, including his stint as head of unit for agriculture at the French Direction Générale du Trésor. So, without any further ado, I will give the floor to Cosimo, to the FAO, who will walk us through the 4 dimensions of food security to provide us with some context, with some theoretical background, and he will try to respond to the question that I asked to each of the 3 speakers. How can rules for trade in food and agriculture contribute to global food security? Cosimo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Facundo. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks for inviting the FAO, of course, to this seminar. So today we will be talking about the interlinkages between trade, food security, and nutrition. We'll be start my presentation by presenting the most recent numbers on hunger. I will then discuss the trends in food and agricultural trade over the last 20-25 years. We will look at the linkages between trade and food security, look at the role of trade policies for food securities, we'll look some at the challenges ahead and some key takeaways. So, between 2021 and 2022, global hunger remained relatively unchanged. However, as we can see from this graph, the situation in 2022 was still much higher compared to the pre-COVID-19 pandemic's level. And if you consider the mid-range, which you can see is 735 million, 122 million people more suffer hunger in 2022 compared to 2019, which is some 9.2% of the world population in 2022 compared to less than 8% in 2019. And if we look at the FAO's forecast, we see as well that almost 600 million people will likely be facing hunger in 2030. So we are kind of far away from reaching the objectives of the Agenda 2030. But how did the world get to this, let's say, critical point? Well, there are 4 major drivers that are undermining food security and nutrition globally. These major drivers are basically affecting our food systems, and we have 4 drivers that, let's say, are external to the food systems, so economic slowdowns and downturns, climate variability and extremes, conflicts, and some drivers which are internal to the food system, like low productivity, inefficient supply chains. And of course, some underlying causes like high and persistent poverty and inequality is of course worsening the situation even more. And I mean, if you look at the news of the last few years, I'm pretty sure you can see some of these drivers happening. But let me move to the trends in international trade. So I'd like to start with a fact, let's say, that the trade is an integral part of our food systems. What we can see in this slide is the share of import and domestic production in food consumption. What is clear is that notwithstanding the income group of countries, each country imports some of its food consumption. Of course, there are clear differences between the low-income countries and the high-income countries. Like low-income countries, on average, like 14%, while, and we were speaking before with the ambassador, with the one of the person of the delegation of Switzerland, almost 60% in this case of Switzerland are importing to meet, let's say, their food consumption in the country. So the fact is, trade exists and is everywhere globally. And here we look at the evolution of the value of food and agricultural trade since the establishment of the WTO. What we see basically is that between 1995 and 2020, food and agricultural trade tripled in nominal terms, and emerging economies have increased their market shares and now play an important role in the global markets. The share of low and middle income countries in global food trade increased from some 30% to what is now 40%, while it's high-income countries maintained a kind of 60% since 2007. And there are more large players today in the market compared to what was in 1995. Emerging economies are now more integrated in the market. And we see here, let's say, to complement this information, this shows the structural change in the global networks of agricultural trade. And this is exactly where you see that the developing countries, the emerging countries, are better integrated today than they were in 1995. Each cycle here denotes a country and basically reflects the position of the country in the periphery or the core of the trade networks. And each cycle, the size of the cycle reflects the importance of the country in the market. Now, as you can see, there are more large players in the market compared to 1995, and these players are less dominant compared to before. And of course, emerging countries have increased their importance in the market, and in most cases, they've moved from the periphery to the core. So the market, let's say, has become more even. But let's move to the key topic of today, if I manage to use this clicker. So the linkages between trade and food security. So the Agenda 2030 put, let's say, a lot of emphasis on the role that trade plays in the promotion of sustainable development. And as a matter of fact, we can find trade mentioned in a lot of goals, SDG 8, SDG 10, SDG 14, SDG 17, and of course SDG 2. And we can see here that trade is considered one of the key means of implementation in the Agenda 2030 to eradicate hunger by 2030. But the question here is, why is trade so important? Why food security is considered to be so related to trade? Well, let's start from the definition of food security, and allow me to read. It's when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. This definition was adopted in 1996 at the World Food Summit, and basically it entails 4 dimensions, 4 pillars that you can see here on the slide. One dimension is availability. Food should be sufficient. Another one is access. The food should be affordable. And then we have utilization, that is extremely important because it is linked to nutrition. People should be able to reach a state of nutritional well-being. And finally, of course, stability. Basically, all these pillars, all these dimensions have to be stable in time. But trade, of course, can have both positive and negative impacts on the four dimensions of food security. So trade is not the panacea or panacea, as a Greek colleague once told me. And the short and long-term impacts are even potentially working one against each other. And it can make it extremely difficult to determine, let's say, a one-fit-for-all solution through trade. Let's see, we'll just talk about just a couple of them, because probably Facundo will kill me if I'm speaking for too long. So let's look at the short term. For instance, in terms of availability, trade can, of course, boost the imports and increase the quantity and variety of food available. But depending on the country, for instance, if we are net exporting countries, the domestic availability of that specific crop may diminish. Okay, so we see here that depending on the specific country, depending on the short or longer term, depending on the specific pillar or dimension, we might have different results. And the same is, for instance, if we look at stability. So we know that imports, for instance, can mitigate the likelihood of shortages stemming from local production shocks. At the same time, like countries that are exposed to international markets may be more vulnerable in case of changes of trade policies of specific exporters. So the assessment from a government perspective can be extremely difficult. In their policy actions, we'll need, let's say, to find a balance to ensure that the expansion of trade works in favor and not against the elimination of hunger in their countries. And this brings us to the impact of trade policies on food security, and at the domestic and at the international level. So what we see here, one by one, are some examples of the so-called welfare impacts for producers, for consumers, and for governments at the national level when a certain policy measure has been implemented. We basically selected three very different but common, let's say, policy measures. So import tariff, export restrictions, and market price support. Let's look at import tariffs. For the producers, of course, they might be happy because producers may receive a higher price and produce more. So the welfare impact for them would be positive. However, for the consumer, they may pay higher prices and may consume less. So in this case, we might have a negative welfare impact. And for the government, it could be positive because you're going to be collecting some taxes from the imports. Export restrictions from the government, from the producer perspective, basically producers may be receiving lower prices and the production may tend to decrease. And if you look as well in the longer term, we can see that many times producers are going away from the crops that are affected by the export restrictions. If we look at the consumers, however, we see that in the short term, of course, consumer prices may decrease, which can again change in the longer term because the impact, we have some analysis that shows that the impact tends to disappear in the longer term. And basically for the government there is no specific impact in the sense that you get no revenue for the specific action. Market price support, of course, for the producers is good because they receive a higher price and they may produce more. But if we look at the consumer perspective, the consumer may tend to pay higher price compared to a situation where you do not have the support. And finally, for the government, of course, the cost of the subsidy program needs to be counted in when you put in place such measure. And of course, each country is different to the other, so each country knows the better what to do. But as you can see from this very simple example, whenever a trade policy is put, let's say, in place at the domestic level, there will always be some winners and losers. That's the basics of every policy you're going to be implementing in your government. And in fact, the real ability of the government is balancing, let's say, all the different aspects of national food security that are stemming from the different policies. But of course, it's also fundamental to look at the international markets. So this is just a flash, basically, of the measures that have been taken by the governments in 2007, 2008. So basically during the food price crisis. And as you see, these measures basically are very similar to the ones we have been looking before in the previous in the previous slide. These, of course, are all legit measures taken by governments to pursue food security. But of course, the simultaneous implementation of multiple trade policies with cumulative effect, they can have as well an impact on the balance between offer and demand. With effects can be, of course, different if we look at the short term or the longer term, and at the domestic level or the international level. And the next slide will be showing exactly this. So it shows the short to longer term effects of simultaneous implementation of multiple trade policies. So as we can see, while this can have, for instance, a positive effect in the short term at the national level, they may have a detrimental effect at the international level and as well at the medium to longer term. And if we look only at the global level, again, the multiple implementation of the simultaneous implementation of this measure with compounding effect can have a negative effect as well at the short term in case of the global level. So taking these things into consideration when you pursue your policy is extremely difficult, but it's important to consider that whatever you do nationally, of course depending on the status and size of the country implementing the measure, but you can have effect as well on the international markets. But let's look now at some of the challenges ahead. There are many challenges. We just selected a couple of them because otherwise I'm going to focus for the next 5 hours. The first one is population growth and demographic changes. So, of course, fast population growth in countries with low agricultural production may mean basically that you might have increased imports, and as well when the populations are moving. So when you have a demographic change, for instance, through urbanization, you need to take into account because you might change what you trade. So in the first case, you see that you might trade more, but in the case of urbanization, for instance, the basket of what you trade can be different. And this, of course, is a huge challenge if you look ahead, and of course, if you look at how things have been changing over the last 20 years and what are the forecasts for the future. Another one is, of course, climate change. Agri-food systems are basically responsible for some 30% of the global emission, and at the same time, agriculture is affected by climate change. So on the left panel on the slide, you can see how agricultural production can be affected by 2050, where the red basically denotes a decrease in production and the green reflects an increase in yields. So it is clear that climate change might have an uneven impact on countries and regions globally. And of course, the climate change will also affect the comparative advantage of countries, and trade will clearly be affected. And if you see on the right side of the slide, you will see a simulation of trade flows in the context of climate change. And you can clearly see that there will be some countries that are expected to to increase their trade flows in the future. So in a nutshell, climate change will, of course, impact the exports and the imports. And allow me just a second to this slide because I love this slide. This basically shows the resilience to shock of markets. So what you can see here is the distribution of trade links for aggregate food, which is on the top, and for individual foods, which is on the bottom. A trade link is, so if country A trades with country B, you have one trade link. If it doesn't, you don't have the trade link. So at the aggregate level, countries source food from many trade partners compared to 1995. And the distribution of trade links today is more symmetric and balanced compared to 1995. This means that basically the market in general is more resilient to the shocks. But at the product level, which is the image below, you can see that it's still extremely uneven. Why? Because countries source, there are more trade links, but many countries source a great part of their food from very specific commodities from specific exporters. And I'm concluding with the takeaways, sorry. So as I was saying, just to wrap up, today the world is way more globalized than it was in 1995. There are more large players than before. Sustainable Development Goals are looking at the eradication of hunger, and we need to ensure, of course, that the expansion of agricultural trade works in favor the elimination of hunger and not against. And of course, trade-related policies play an important role. But of course, policies taken in countries can have implication for the country itself, because it's difficult to balance, let's say, the trade-offs, and as well the food security targets in other countries. And of course, the point is, looking at the resilience, climate change, and demographic changes, that if we have an open and well-functioning global markets, this will probably promote food security in the future. Thank you very much for the attention. Sorry, Facundo. I'll pass the floor to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cosimo. This has been a very nice overview. Then I will move on now to the ambassadors. Excellencies, my question for you would be, which of the 7 negotiation issues on the agricultural agenda do you think has the highest potential to promote global food security? Is there any issue, more than one issue, the 7 negotiation issues, and the cross-cutting theme of transparency? I would be keen to seek your views on that. Embajadora, tiene la palabra.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the IISD for this invitation. Especially thank you, Facundo, for reaching out and inviting me to be with you today. I see that this agriculture is still an issue that raised a lot of attention. I can see in this room, full packed. So I'm very happy for that, because as Facundo said, I'm an agricultural economist. Indeed, before being the ambassador of Chile to the WTO, I was the chair of the Agricultural Economics Department of the University of Chile. So it's my great pleasure to be here with you today. Well, I will start following up what Cosimo presented, and also trying to answer your question, Facundo, with something very short, but then I will I will elaborate more. Everything is related to food security. I will start saying that. Cosimo already mentioned that he showed specific examples as how the different pillars, the different discussions that we are having on the agricultural negotiations are all of them related to food security in one way or another. So for Chile, we promote an holistic approach to these negotiations, because we are convinced that everything that we are negotiating is related to food security. And it's not one pillar more related than the other. Everything is related to food security. Because when we think about food security is the consequence of how food systems work. And food systems are the networks of different actors, different policies, different innovations, different relationships, all of them related to what we have in our plates when we have lunch, when we have dinner. So food systems are so complex that every policy that we make has an impact on food systems, and then has an impact on food security. So that's why from Chile we promote in the agricultural negotiations the holistic and comprehensive approach. So why these negotiations are so relevant for Chile? Well, Chile is an agricultural exporting country. About a quarter of our exports are related to forestry, are related to agricultural products. So for us, for our international economic relations, agriculture is very, very, very relevant. It's a main issue, it's a main sector. We have had traditionally an agricultural trade surplus. We are the main exporters of fruit products at the southern hemisphere. So we are selling our products all around the world, and in that sense, for us, agricultural negotiations are very relevant, but in the WTO also SPS and PVT issues are very relevant, because we sell products that need to arrive to our destination markets with good quality, with good food safety. And in that sense, of course, Chile Chile is looking at what is going on this week on agricultural negotiations and recognizes the complexity of what we have in our hands. On food security, we are convinced that Chile contributes to global food security because of what I have said. We are a major exporter, for example, for food products, so we contribute to global food security. So we think also that at agricultural negotiations, we should think about food security in terms of the effects for our people internally, but also on the effects that we have as exporters on global food security. We are looking at also from that point of view. Of course, we are facing many challenges in the sense of maintaining our food exports and our contribution to global food security. For example, energy crisis, the prices of energy, which are very relevant in the field, the trade effects of COVID-19, which we can still feel when we talk with exporters, the increasing trade restrictions, very much related to the effects of COVID-19, of course, climate change and economic crisis. So we think it's even more relevant that we can do something significant during this week on agriculture because the context that our exporters are facing is not easy. It's not easy right now. In that sense, I would like to highlight 5-6 pillars of how we face agricultural negotiations, how Chile is in agricultural negotiations at the WTO. So, first, Chile actively seeks fair, predictable, transparent, equitable, open, and market-oriented agricultural trade. So, as Cosimo said, we are convinced that trade contributes to food security. And Chile, as food exporter, contributes to global food security. We support agricultural reform. As you know, Article 20 of the Agreement of Agriculture says that we have to follow a process of reform that is still going on. So we support agricultural reform as per Article 20 of the Agreement on Agriculture. We, as I said before, advocate for a comprehensive approach because we are absolutely convinced that everything that we are negotiating addresses and has a relationship with food security. And in that sense, that's why we think we should have a balanced and comprehensive approach to these negotiations. We recognize the complexity of the global context, including issues like protectionism, food insecurity, environmental and climate impacts, and market imbalances. So, although we have been successful in our incorporation to international markets for agricultural products, we are aware, as I said before, of the challenges that not only our exporters, but exporters and producers, farmers all around the world are facing, and also our population in terms of food security. We participate very actively, as I said before, in these negotiations with a view of having a balanced package at the end of the day. And with consideration of developing country, Chile is also a developing country. But we can't look at developing countries from a monolithic perspective. Developing countries in agriculture, as well as in other issues, we have different realities. So we need to address them considering that heterogeneity. There are developing countries that are net importers. There are developing countries as us that are net exporters. There are developing countries that have very, very relevant problems on food access. And there are other developing countries as us that have very important problems related to obesity and overweight of the population. So we need to recognize that diversity in terms of developing countries. So having said that, which are our objectives for MC13 in agriculture? First, on domestic support, we aim for a clear path, limiting internally distorting agricultural trade support. We support modalities to limit and reduce current internal support rights, favoring a flexible approach as the one presented by Costa Rica, who presented a paper that technically is, we think, very high quality and has that approach to domestic support. And we advocate also for proportionality and progressivity to address domestic support. On public stockholding, Chile is not a demander. We do not have extensive programs of public stockholding, but of course we are open to the discussion because, as I said before, we recognize the diversity of developing countries. So even if we are not a demander, we are open to this discussion. However, of course, we are concerned about the effects of PSH on domestic prices, international markets, production, and private sector involvement, although we are open to the discussion, of course, and this is one of the topics or of the issues for the negotiations. On market access, we support the agreement's goal of market-oriented agricultural reform and oppose a protectionism that affects global markets functioning, because again, we believe that trade is part of the solution. On export competition, we have been monitoring the discussions and we support enhancing transparency and a gradual process to strengthen disciplines, ensuring effective surveillance and transparency mechanisms. I know that very often transparency is not so sexy in these negotiations, but we think it's also a very relevant tool, especially in terms of export competition. So on those 4 issues, we are committed with the discussion in the terms that I have mentioned. And finally, I want to say that we think that for advancing, we need to create consensus, and on that is very relevant the cooperation in different configurations. Chile is part of the Cairns Group, which is a group of agricultural exporters, and there we are supporting the proposal designed by Costa Rica on domestic support, which I have mentioned. But we are engaging in these conversations, and we are defending the need for the agricultural reform. But we also are part of a group of Latin American countries that in MC12, but also now in MC13, we are presenting a declaration to also move the conversations and having clear mandates that can allow us, hopefully now, but if not, at least in MC14 to have the very waited for us agricultural reform. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Embajadora, for your presentation. I will take note of your comment regarding the importance of addressing the 7 negotiation issues on the agenda, plus the cross-cutting themes of transparency. And now I will move on to Ambassador Etienne Boudot de Lambille, Permanent Representative of France to the WTO. Ambassador, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Facundo, and thank you very much to the IISD, International Institute for Sustainable Development, for the Trade and Sustainability Hub. Actually, it's even more packed than on the other side, although a little bit smaller. It's huge on the other side. And thank you very much for organizing this session on WTO and food security. It's it's a very complex issue, as actually Cosimo just showed us, and it shows as well, your presentation, Cosimo, how difficult it is for policymakers to design the right policies on the. And I'm speaking at a time right now, we're having also in Europe a farmers' protest, not specifically on food security, but there are many issues of concerns. And it's in several different European countries, but also in France. And I'd like to articulate my presentation into 3 parts, and also trying to answer your question. The first one, I'd like to have a look back at what we have achieved, we have been achieving so far in the WTO on food security. Then look at what we are currently trying to negotiate, and finally try to open a little bit the perspective towards new debates. So, when preparing myself for this presentation, I tried to look back at what were the objectives of the policymakers at the beginning of the Rio Round in 1986 in Punta del Este, and I found this Punta del Este declaration. And on the agricultural negotiation, the main goals are defined here. I'd like to insist on the final words: to reduce the uncertainty, imbalances, and instability in world agricultural markets. And with those terms, I think, are really much intertwined with the debate on food policy, food security, even though food security per se was not mentioned at that time. Then we had a decade of negotiations, more or less, and in 1995, the agreement on agriculture with this well-known 3 pillars on market access, reduction of tariffs with special safeguard provisions, domestic support with focus on on reduction of distortive domestic support subsidies, plus the details. I won't go into the details. Feel free if you have any question afterwards. And finally, on export competition, this 3rd pillar was at that time much less precise in terms of disciplines, but at least I said 3 areas: export subsidies, export finance, and international food aid, where disciplines could be more elaborated. Then afterwards, in 3 Ministerial, we had much less ambitious results in terms of agriculture and food security, but anyway, some of them. In Bali, in 2013, the temporary peace clause on the public stockholdings, on existing public stockholdings programs at that time for developing countries. In 2015 in Nairobi, mostly the most important, I think, was a decision to end export subsidies with immediate effect for developed countries, and a phase-out calendar for developing countries, depending on status. And finally, in Geneva in 2022, 2 years ago, the decision not to have, by all WTO members, not to impose any export restrictions on the purchase by the World Food Programme. So, can we, as it worked, was it efficient? It's hard to tell. I think it's a personal opinion. I think there is really a need for scholars, maybe I turn to Cosimo and others, to make a real bilan, so to say, of the balance, a record of the agreement on agriculture on the WTO over 20 years, 25 years. It's really hard to tell what is linked or not linked to the WTO agreements and its successive decisions, ministerial decisions. But as a matter of fact, as you recalled, volume of trades in agricultural products tripled. Agricultural production, food products productions, I think even get multiplied by 5. And until, as you recall at the beginning as well, until 2015, we had a decrease in prevalence of hunger worldwide, although probably not enough and at a very slow rhythm. And on top of that, it stopped. Probably it started to get slower after the financial crisis and economic crisis of the late 2000s, and of course the pandemics put an immediate and dramatic halt to it. Then, if we look at the EU situation in terms of EU supports, here I'd like to draw your attention on the blue line. The blue line shows total support within the EU in percentage of the total value of production. So since 1995, it went up from 40% to 21% of the total value of production. So even if in amounts of euros the support has been relatively stable, in percentage of production it's a major decrease. So that was a little bit for the past and what has been achieved so far in the WTO context. What can we do now to further address and tackle the issue of food security challenges? It's objectively very difficult because we don't have consensus among WTO members on the policy tools, neither on the policy tools nor on the way to do it. What we, as an EU member states, and I think it's clearly an EU position, definitely transparency remains a key element. I remember back in 2008, during the French presidency of the G20, when we had a food crisis already, a food prices crisis mostly, we were instrumental to create EMIS, the Agricultural Market Information System, which puts together FAO, World Bank, I guess IMF, WTO, and some others, I don't remember who exactly, to try to increase transparency on the food markets prices, provide more data, encourage international cooperation on food security. It remains, here in the WTO, it remains, as Sophia just said, a very important issue. It is definitely important for export restrictions. It is definitely important for export subsidies. And the EU has made, in the current debate, some proposal to simplify and streamline notifications on food aid and export restrictions. The second element is export restrictions. But again, it's not consensual among WTO members. But there are already some disciplines in the existing agreement on agriculture, but at least we have to make sure those disciplines, we have to make sure the members abide by those disciplines. That means they have to be temporary, targeted, transparent, and we have to make sure they minimize trade distortions. And finally, the third element, and Sophia mentioned it as well, is a public stockholding. The EU is ready to engage in a discussion of public stockholding and getting a permanent solution. We used to have in the EU public stockholding schemes 20 years ago with market support. So we know it was quite an expensive policy. At that time there was huge debate among EU member states on the sustainability, financial sustainability of this system. But we know also from this experience that it can have distorting effects. We were heavily criticized at that time by the rest of the world, and for example Africa, for all the surplus we were selling or trying to sell on world markets at a discounted price. So therefore, we are ready to engage on a discussion on PSH, but again, we want to make sure that it takes into account the risk of trade distortions. So we need disciplines to make sure there are transparency elements, safeguards on exports, and also precise objectives in terms of food security targets. Finally, so I don't want to be too long, I'd like to look a little bit beyond the current. What's struck me here, not here in Geneva as ambassador for France, is that the debate as it has been framed in the WTO for the last 20 years, does not allow us to tackle the new challenges. We don't talk in Geneva, in the Committee of Agriculture, or on the Committee on Agriculture on special session, we don't talk about sustainable agriculture and food systems. Whereas, at the same time, for example, if we look at what happened at COP28 in Dubai 2 months ago, we had more than 159 countries which pledged to include agriculture and food in their climate plans. We don't really talk about food security per se, although we try. And we don't talk as well about food production. So the idea is, how can we a little bit reframe the debate? Because those debates will happen anyway. It will happen at the COP climate. It will happen, OECD has been working a lot, the 40, I don't remember how many members there are at OECD. They issued a ministerial statement a few months ago on sustainable food systems. So those debates will happen. If we want the WTO to be part of the debate and contribute positively, we probably need to reframe a little bit the debate we're having in a WTO context. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I appreciate the overview that you provided at the beginning on the early times of the negotiations, as well as your views on how to achieve effective but limited results in the context of the huge divergences we have among WTO members, and also your last comment regarding the issues that are not being discussed at the COAs, at the cultural negotiations concerning sustainability. You mentioned 2 or 3. This is very valuable. And with that, we have concluded the first part of our session. What I will do now is to open the floor for questions. You can raise your hands. The questions have to deal specifically with the content of the presentations. We will not be discussing the agricultural policies of specific members. But before, I will make use of my role of moderator to pose a very quick question to each of the speakers, maybe to the 2 ambassadors. My question is, you have been speaking, you spoke so far about the agricultural negotiations, about the COAs. And indeed, Ambassador Etienne made a few suggestions regarding the COAs. But very interesting work has been taking place also within the COA, the regular session of the Committee on Agriculture. For those of you who are not aware of that, there is a working group. There was a working group on food security at the WTO that concluded with the presentation of a report by the chair of that working group with key recommendations and findings for LDCs and NFIDCs that in the WTO jargon stands for net food importing developing countries. So these discussions are quite relevant for these 2 groups of countries. And so my question for the ambassadors would be, which of the 4 big things discussed under this work program do you think is more relevant to advance food security for LDCs and FIDCs? And I will briefly go through them. They are access to international food markets, financing of food imports, agricultural production and resilience of LDCs and FIDCs, and then we have horizontal issues such as cooperation among international organizations on various areas. Ambassador, you mentioned the example of AMIS. This is, I think, a clear example of cooperation for transparency. Also, there was some discussion on global market intelligence and surveillance. So my question would be specifically, which of these 4 issues do you think has highest potential to advance, maybe to progress, and to contribute to the food security of these 2 groups, LDCs and FIDCs? Ambassador Bosa.
Well, thank you very much, Facundo, for giving me the floor again. Well, I would like to say, first of all, that I think the work that the COA has been doing since MC12 with regard to food security and especially food insecurity, targeting to the case of net importers and LDCs, has been very relevant. Indeed, like 1 year ago, in that context, we had a seminar in which Facundo participated and analyzed the effect of the raise of the prices of pesticides. If you remember, months ago we had a high rise of the prices of pesticides, even double and triple price, and that had a very strong impact in our farmers, in our producers, in their costs. So we had, at that time, we had a seminar, a session in the COA to have a conversation about that. So what I like very much about the COA in comparison with the COAs is that it can be a space to have more candid and fluid exchange of ideas, experiences, and that's something that we think that is very valuable. So about which aspects? Well, I will give you my personal opinion, I have to say. This is not something, this is not Chile speaking, this is Sofia Bosa speaking. But I think that, of course, the basis, all the four aspects that you have mentioned, all of them, and also prosthetic aspects, all of them are related to food security, again. But, of course, the basis is the agricultural production and the resilience itself. Because if we do not have the agricultural production, it's very difficult that we have trade and we have the other steps from the food system. If you look at the food system, the basis is the production. So looking at that is very relevant. And I think it's very interesting how the COA has approached that, and that's why for us was something very relevant to have that side event on pesticides, because very often we have looked at the food system from the side of the trade. What happens when you already have the production and you try to put your production in the different markets? But you need to look also at what enables farmers to have a competitive production. That's very important, and I hope that that's a conversation that we can have more and more in the organization, and not only a competitive production, but also a sustainable production. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. First, we were very much in agreement with all what is in this draft report, because the report has not yet been adopted by the full membership on food security in the Committee of Agriculture. Well, on the first point, which is access to markets, what do you say? The key issue that we can tackle in the short run is definitely export restrictions, from my point of view. It's my personal point of view. And then I would probably more have a look. The financing issue, it's not really a topic for WTO. We don't do financing. We don't do financing policy in the WTO. We can discuss of it, but it's not really where the WTO can have added value and a real effect. But the most important, I think, is how do you increase the production in a sustainable way in those countries. So not only rely on imports or food aid, but how do you develop new productions, taking into account the local challenges in terms of climate, soil, fertilizers, and so on. I just put the last slide I did not comment earlier. This slide relates to what we're trying to do under the current EU Common Agricultural Policy, but this could be actually very much of interest as well to develop agricultural production in a sustainable way in net food importing developing countries.
Well, thank you very much